All right. This is the Responding to Acquired Brain Injury in Problem Gambling Treatment session. We have Katie Richard and Tom Beckers. Katie Richard is the current Outpatient Intake Supervisor for Vinland Center, Minneapolis location. Katie joined the outpatient team as they were building the gambling program and became certified to provide gambling counseling in September 2020. She is currently the co-chair of the Minnesota DHS Advisory Committee on Compulsive Gambling to help improve the gambling provider community. She is currently the vice president of the MNAPG Board of Directors since July 2022. Tom Beckers is the Director of Residential Services, has worked in the field of chemical health, substance use disorder treatment for 18 years. For the last 16 years, he has worked with adults at Vinland Center, a 61-bed residential substance use disorder treatment program located in Loretto, Minnesota in Hennepin County, specifically serving those suffering from substance abuse and cognitive deficits. He has provided professional and community-based trainings on topics related to the field of substance use disorders and brain injury, partnering with entities such as the University of Minnesota and Brain Injury Alliance of Minnesota. He's co-authored a curriculum that adapts mindfulness practices for people with cognitive deficits and is cited as a co-contributor on a published research study that examines the effects that mindfulness practice has on people who are suffering from cognitive deficits, TBI, and substance use disorders. Tom is an in-demand speaker due to his ability to engage and entertain audiences whilst providing essential information to help professionals in the field identify, relate, and ultimately advocate for those with cognitive deficits. Katie and Tom.
Thank you, Marie. I appreciate that. So I'm Katie, and Marie did a wonderful job introducing us. So we are going to be talking about responding to acquired brain injuries and problem gambling treatment. And so Tom and I both work at Vinland doing lots of different hats, and I am at the outpatient location, and I work with both substance use and gambling clients. And Tom is at our residential, and he works just with substance use clients. We both work with clients who have traumatic brain injuries. And the traumatic brain injuries are most commonly concussions, strokes, aneurysms, motor vehicle accidents, comprehension stuff like autism and fetal alcohol syndrome also comes into comprehension specialties. So I know quite a few people in the audience, and so I know quite a few people work with clients or have contact with clients, so that's good. So we'll just be talking more about how the TBIs and gambling overtake addiction and can be very tricky to work with. Also, if you have questions, please let us know as we go through so we can answer them. And I know online they will let us know if we have questions as well. So our learning objectives today are to introduce parts of the brain directly affected by gambling, and I'll talk more about that. And then learn how traumatic brain injuries, or TBIs, I might refer to it as a TBI, affect and changes how you process gambling behaviors. And then how to work with someone who has a TBI and a gambling use disorder. So one of the directly affected areas in gambling, there's two main ones, and I'll talk about both, is the ventral striatum. Very interesting word to try to pronounce. So this is right between your ears. So when people say they can see your brain, that's probably the part they're looking at. It's also related to our reward system, and it's where we figure out if we want to do something again and again and again. And it has to do with our motivation levels as well. So if we like doing something again and again, we're going to be motivated to do it again. Whether we're winning or losing, that comes with the gambling addiction. And so then it's also related to the olfactory, which is your sense of smell, which is a very deep memory triggering sensory part of your body. So if you walk into a casino or you walk into someplace that you're familiar with and you smell the air, that can trigger your reward system to say, oh, this is a good place, or oh, this is a bad place, but I'm still gonna come in and engage in my addiction. And so when someone who has a traumatic brain injury and this is affected, that can very much skew what is good and bad in their reward system. So yeah. Another directly affected area is the prefrontal cortex, and I could do so much talking about the prefrontal cortex, but very briefly, it's right in the front of your brain. It is where we have most of our executive functioning. This is also the part that comes on later on in life, around 24, 25, 26. That's when you're going to start seeing all of those logic-based systems come in. This is where fight, flight, or freeze processes happen. And so if you have a prefrontal cortex injury, then especially if it's before 24, 25, you're not gonna come and show up to the addiction with a full deck of reasoning. And that's okay. That's part of what we do to rewrite addiction in substance and gambling. The prefrontal cortex also has to do with future planning and decision making. And so when you have someone in front of you who has to figure out how to do their finances at age 45, and they've never done that and they have a traumatic brain injury, it takes months of planning, daily, hour by hour planning sometimes to come up with their schedule or how to pay something. Because they'll have a shoebox that they didn't know existed underneath their bed that has overdue bills in it. You have to sort through that, and then all the emotions that come with it, because it's not just the bill, it's, well, how come you didn't pay that? Well, X, Y, and Z was going on in my life that caused it to be a catastrophe. And so that traumatic brain injury definitely empowers those emotions to become overwhelming. And that can be really tricky to work with. Let's see. So instant gratification, the long haul, for people who work with clients, you see this with both gambling and substance, is that they will walk away from their addiction and they'll be like, well, I want the change now. Okay, well, unfortunately, we're gonna have to go day by day with this because you've been artificially producing your happiness and your rewards and your motivation levels, and so that's not going to come back easily. It takes more time than that. And so we're looking at people who have no steady source of income, or if they do have a source of income, they're not spending it correctly. And so that is what I like to call the debt, the face debt and the faceless debt. And so what I mean by that is the face debt is who you owe for personal, and that would be like you owe grandma $6,000 because you passed bad checks, and the faceless debt would be, oh, they took out a payday loan and now they don't have anybody or recognition on who they would pay that back to besides a company. And so getting them to see that they need to do both and the emotions tied to both of them can be really challenging and overwhelming. Their debt in general is overwhelming. Most of them have it. And organizing that shoebox of past due bills or being able to pay rent on time doesn't come easy. And many times people with comprehension don't prioritize stuff very well. And so again, paying back their mom or dad comes before paying rent. And that puts them in debt and might make them homeless. But man, it felt really good to pay mom off because she's owed me my life. And seeing how them not being homeless and then paying back mom a little bit later, the weight of that is very tricky to try to figure out with them. It takes a long time, especially with the traumatic brain injury, for them to catch on. Legal issues, so specific things tied to legal issues are like the embezzlement, the check forgery, identity theft. That's something that they can't necessarily walk away from, and so helping them see how they need to be accountable to probation, and that can be very rewarding to probation, can help them get off of probation versus you see them 10 years working with the same PO and they know the same story over and over again in violations. Let's get them set up to be successful right away. And then exclusions, so that would be going to a casino and excluding themselves one by one, or going online and banning themselves. And so that would entail usually months, if ever, a work in process to get them to go. And because their prefrontal cortex might have an injury to it, that can almost be an impulsive decision. So you'll work months on what does it take to exclude yourself and all the emotions. And then one day they'll just be like, well, I excluded myself. And it will be a total surprise to you. And it will be an impulsive decision that they've rewarded themselves with. So that's if they ever do it, which is another tricky bit. So cognitive distortions. So one thing with a traumatic brain injury is it can put you in your place of mistruths or exaggerations. One word with traumatic brain injuries, especially initially after a brain injury, is confabulation. And confabulation is where they literally say something that doesn't exist. And it's not the truth, but it's the place they exist at the time. And so a distortion would be, I work with a gentleman who thought he was just the best at blackjack. And I don't know if that's true. I didn't meet him in that lifetime. But now he's had a stroke. He still thinks he's really good at blackjack, and he's not. Because the parts of his brain that were affected were his logic, reasoning, and his mathematics skills. And so in order to count cards, you have to have both of those processes. And so going through that acceptance of I had a stroke and I gamble has taken over a year. And we're still working through it. I mean, he's a really nice guy, so we're working through that. If you've ever talked to a gambler, they will tell you that they know how the machines work. They know that that machine's gonna pay. When I walked away from that machine, and that lady walked up and they hit that machine and she won, that was my win. And that is a distortion, because whether you win or lose, that wasn't your win when they won. That was to get you to try to come back, to make you regret that you walked away. And that's all part of your prefrontal cortex is, dang it, I should have stayed, but you shouldn't have. So flipping that switch and showing them just because they won doesn't mean you would have is very tricky. Keeping up with the digital slot machines. So I have several clients who are older, and one of them has seizures and another one had a stroke, but they started gambling decades ago, and the slot machines were physically different. They were not the supercomputers that we know today. And so when you sit down at a slot machine, one of them, she just did it for a free turkey. I promise you, it was an hour-long conversation about a turkey. But she hits that slot machine and she just goes for a ride because she can't keep up with all of the things that are happening on the screen. But her brain lights up like a Christmas tree because her reward system is going crazy. Her prefrontal cortex is like, yes! And discussing with her about how that free turkey wasn't actually free caused her to be very bummed out, because then she had the guilt and the shame that came afterwards. And so we talked about how she can just go buy a turkey for herself, and that's more rewarding than going to the casino to get one. And it's like, okay. But she couldn't keep up with any of that. And she'll tell me stories about the past where when Hinckley first opened, she knew which slot machines were hot and which ones weren't. And that's the difference now. So one of the cognitive distortions that's a bummer is that the debt will never go away. And so when you're meeting with a client who has debt and they've got mental health and a TBI, if their prefrontal cortex has been affected by an injury and their reward system is down and their motivation is low and they're at 3 in the morning driving back from the casino, they might attempt some stuff that they really don't want to talk about with you the next day, and it's a bummer. A lot of clients will attempt and or complete suicide because they feel like a burden and a bummer to be around their family, like they have no support. And so being able to give them a safe space to talk about that stuff will help prevent them from doing it again. And so that's important. But this is definitely a cognitive distortion, because if you show up and you do honest money, if you start paying your bills on time, if you start rebuilding your relationships, the debt emotionally and physically can go away. They just have to be able to wait it out with you. So then self-love, because I don't want to be a total bummer. So self-love, from my point of view as a provider, is teaching them to like themselves again, to work with themselves again, to trust themselves again. And this can take a long time, with or without a traumatic brain injury, because you're rebuilding literally a person sometimes. And so that is. So then when they have rebuilt their self-love, they start trying things and their reward system starts coming back online naturally. So like that pair of shoes they never bought themselves, they'll go out and buy because they feel like they can trust themselves to make a purchase. And that's an important thing to celebrate, the little wins, because then that gives them more confidence to do it again. Also, I like to use a lot of metaphors with my clients. And so one I have with a client is gardening. And so thinking about gambling is tilling the ground. Placing the bets is sowing the seeds. Watching the game is watching the plants grow. Harvesting is collecting your winnings or licking your wounds from losing. And so how do we take that metaphor and apply it to something else, which his hobby is now travel. It's a really nice hobby, I know. So his hobby is traveling. And so how do we plant the seeds? How do we watch them grow? How do we follow through on the travel and enjoy it as though it was a win from gambling? You know, because you can start to interchange that stuff. And so he's had success with that, thankfully. And he's got many vacations planned, and I'm very envious of it, but that's for him. So then self-esteem. I think self-esteem is a little bit different than self-love, because it's kind of like pushing them to go the direction that you need them to, but trusting themselves to go, versus you being directive and telling them, oh, you have to go down this path. Well, no, you can go down this path if you want, and I'll support you either way. And then just celebrating that they can do it. Having long-term goals is a huge thing for them. So my client who has traveling as a hobby, that is a long-term goal. So he'll plan a trip for February. That's a long-term goal. He's never had those before. He just told me he wanted to do a profit and loss with me, and I think that's exciting. A profit and loss is where you go over your finances for the year, and he's never done that before, so that's exciting. Having separation from self and gambling is a huge important part to getting rid of gambling in your life, taking its power away. And that's part of self-esteem, is being able to say, yeah, I'm ready to walk away from this for sure. Let's see. So yeah. Next up is Mr. Tom to tell you more about the inner workings of working with traumatic brain injury and gambling. So yeah, all yours.
Transitional clap. I won't expect a clap when I'm done, because you've already clapped like once. Just a transitional clap, which we can do. Thank you. Nice to see everyone. I'm not used to speaking behind a podium, so I like to move around a lot. So this is really going to be a challenge. So if I start flailing about, don't worry, I'm fine. But I'm just going to stay close to the mic. For those of you online, welcome. We'll take a little break from all the filing that you're doing in your office while we're hanging out together, I'm sure, right? I always, when I do webinars and say that, I always hope that somebody in an office someplace goes like, so welcome. So, as others mentioned, my name is Tom Beckers, and I am the Director of Residential Services at Vinland Center. So I'm the director of the residential portion of the program and have been working with folks with cognitive deficits for a while. The purpose of my time with you is I hope to just provide something that you can use or something that of value that you might need. I don't always know wherever I go speak, excuse me, those, kind of how you interact with people or where you're interacting with people. I know a couple of you and know how you do that, but if you're meeting with people in the community, whatever that you do, chances are you're going to run into some people that have histories of brain injuries or cognitive deficits. The broader kind of category that I work from is cognitive deficits, and certainly acquired brain injury is a form of, contributes to cognitive deficits. So wherever you are in the service delivery field working with people, I hope there's something for you that you can use. I started doing more talks in 2013 when I became aware, working at Vinland Center for a while, that people with brain injuries don't walk around telling people they have brain injuries. And it's not on a t-shirt, it's not on a banner, it's not tattooed across their forehead, so they don't usually talk about it. And lots of people in my group right now, and the people that are in the program, don't necessarily, again, look like they have a brain injury. So in kind of talking with them a little bit, just kind of started to kind of come up with a few ideas and then go out into the community and again, just kind of talk to folks. Vinland Center is a place that is kind of a specialty program, so we work with people with histories of cognitive deficits and brain injuries, but again, there's plenty of people in lots of different programs, and of course you in the gambling treatment community are running into them there as well. So the first slide just kind of looks at the general idea that, brain injury as being kind of a silent epidemic. I will tell you, there's been lots of clients, one in particular I have a memory of, who came into the program at Vinland Center and was educated on the East Coast and had a professional life and a practice and was living a life. He was a drinker most of his adult life and drank one evening and fell down a flight of stairs, and his life changed after that. So he came to residential treatment to receive residential chemical health treatment. He had an alcohol use disorder, and when I looked at the calendar, I realized he got a DWI and had to go to court on this date, and so he was coming in the door right at about the 28-day, 30-day mark so he could get a certificate and go to court to show them that that he had gone to treatment, because presumably that's what his lawyer recommended him to do. The reason why I tell you that is he was a contemplator for his substance use disorder, which means that he thought it was probably a good idea to look at this a little closer, but he wasn't really sure if he was going to quit. But he was a pre-contemplator for treatment. And so a pre-contemplator means he didn't think it was important to go to treatment in order to have that habit change take effect. He thought he could take care of it on his own, right? So he kind of came into the program and sat in most of my groups with his arms crossed and rolled his eyes a lot and thought everybody was stupid and this whole thing was kind of dumb and just, I'm just kind of here to just get through this and everything. But one day, I saw him down the hall, and he was having an animated conversation with another person in the program, and I couldn't hear what they were talking about, but noticed 2 days later that he continued to have a rather animated conversation with this other person in the program. And I asked him about it. I said, hey, what's up? It seems like you met somebody. You haven't really invested too much time or energy in kind of connecting with the group or anything, so what's up? And he goes, well, he had a similar experience as I did. He had a fall, and so we were comparing notes and just kind of talking about what it was like after we had our brain injury. And I asked him, I said, well, how many people have you talked to about your brain injury? And before I was done with the sentence, he was already shaking his head. And when I talked to his dad, I was his case manager at the time, I asked him, I said, does he ever talk about this, or does he ever, and his dad said, look, he's just been drinking in his apartment for 1.5 years and hasn't really connected with anybody whatsoever. So bare minimum, Vinland Center, or even your interactions with people to open the door to have discussions about brain injury is helpful in and of itself, because lots of people just kind of live with it and don't really talk about it a whole bunch, which for someone that works in the addictions field, of course, that's kind of a big thing. But lots of the guys in my group get a lot of attention from places they don't want, like corrections, et cetera, et cetera. So, somebody's paying attention to them. But so let's go through. So the way this is kind of laid out, the way my talk is kind of laid out, is in a way how I might share some of this with the clients that I'm working with as well, right? So I'm simultaneously sharing with you some things that I teach them. When I first started doing talks, and where some of my interest lies, is to work with other providers and systems to say, here's some things that you can talk about, here's some ways that you can open the door to conversations about brain injury, right? So the first thing that we can kind of talk about is just the phenomenon of what's called the coup contra coup injury, right? So coup contra coup is not a daiquiri in the Bahamas. It's a coup contra coup injury is the phenomenon of what happens when someone experiences applied forces to the brain. And so what a coup contra coup injury means is that your brain is encased in your skull in a particular way, right? And so it's just kind of nestled in there, and it's all kind of snug, and it's all kind of pressurized, and it's all nice and tidy and comfortable in there. When a traumatic force runs into the skull, the brain is typically most likely to move in a north-south direction versus kind of an east-west direction. Now, certainly fractures and swelling and things like that certainly happen, but for many of the people that I work with and we talk about brain injury, that brain kind of moves north and south. So that's important, and the reason why that's important is if the brain moves in a north-south direction, oftentimes what happens, obviously, is the back will be affected, but if the back will be affected, then the front will be affected. So Katie talked a little bit about prefrontal cortex and frontal lobe functioning. One of the things that the frontal lobe is responsible for is self-awareness. And so sometimes when I work with people and talk with them, when we talk about awareness of brain injury, one way to kind of go into it and to talk a little bit about it is actually talk about their balance. And you might go, well, gee, Tom, what are you talking about, their balance? Well, if someone has a motor vehicle accident, an assault, a fall, et cetera, what they'll really notice experientially is that after their brain injury, their balance is way off. So if you ask someone, instead of saying, are you aware that you don't manage time or remember things or process things very well, that's kind of a sort of, puts up this sort of, folks don't really want to kind of talk about that, and why would they? That's kind of painful. But when they talk about the motor vehicle accident, you go, hey, what was your balance like afterwards? Oh man, my balance was like really bad. Yeah, it was really, really terrible. Well, so when you talk about coup contra coup injuries with them, you can kind of make the argument, bye Marty, see ya, yep, drive safe, it's a long drive, go slow, speed limit only. All right, I told her I was gonna do that, so just had to do it. So it's a lot easier to talk about someone's balance, right? Because that's a rather impersonal thing, right? It's like your balance is off. Like, what can you do about that? And everybody's like, what can I do about that? My balance is off. When you talk about a coup contra coup injury, you can make the argument, well, dude, if the back got bumped, then maybe the front got bumped. And the fact is the frontal lobe is partially responsible for self-awareness. So maybe your awareness is a little, my awareness, really? Yeah, because, da-da-da-da-da, yep. And you can do things with them. I don't have the space or the time in this talk to do things that you can do things that show how the cerebellum and the occipital lobe work together to kind of show that kind of balance piece. And anybody can do that, and I'll do that sometimes with folks that I work with. Again, provided that they have enough balance where it's safe enough to do so, I can have them do this kind of heel to toe walk thing, and then they close their eyes, and then their balance is really off. And so that's a good indicator. It's like, well, again, if that back is a little bumped, then the front is probably bumped too. So that's a very kind of specific area, right? If we talk about diffuse axonal injuries, now when we hear the word diffuse, we're talking a little bit more network-wide, a little bit more spread out. So when the brain bumps up against the skull in the way that I told you about in that coup contra coup way, your brain, of course, has these two halves, right? And so we kind of know that this is your, I like listening to a Deep Purple record and, coloring in my coloring book, and this is, hey, let's get into that accounting worksheet, you know what I mean? So we got these two halves, right? So when those two halves are injured, they can twist a little bit. We have these fibers that kind of connect those two halves, the corpus callosum. There's lots of axons, neurons in your brain. I mean, trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions, right? There's just a ton. What can happen to these axons is axonal shearing. And so if you can imagine like a garden hose, for example, and you hook it up to the spigot in the house and you run it out and you turn the water on full blast, you would presume that you would get pretty good water pressure, provided that everything else is, working appropriately. But if you take a pocket knife and you start hacking away at the hose and you've got like, water coming out of every part of the hose, what do you think is going to happen to the water pressure in the hose? It's going to go down, right? And so folks that have axonal shearing, diffuse axonal shearing, means that sort of systemic-wide, network-wide, there's disruptions. And one of the main things that people run into is fatigue. And so lots of folks with histories of brain injury and cognitive deficits, they have lower energy. Now that in and of itself applies to, if you extrapolate that into the many places that we meet with people and we talk with them, it's really going to be important to think about what are we going to talk about and for how long and those types of things, right? So which we'll kind of get to those in a second. So by the way, if you have any questions, anything pops up or anything, just blurt it out, spit it out. I'm not sure how we're doing it online. I don't think I have a chat room here, do I? But I'm best in conversation, so if you have something that just like, oh, I had this thought or a question, don't hesitate, throw something at me, yell and scream, cry, do whatever you got to do to let me know and I'll pause. Okay, so that's the brain stuff, that's the hardware stuff. So let's talk about the cognitive processes. Now again, I did a group yesterday where we talk, I do a group every couple weeks with the guys in the program. We do like a brain injury 101 group. And so I have I try to have as many experiential activities as I can to point out certain parts of how the brain functions. Again, one of the things I want to offer you is I think no matter what it is that you're doing and how you're working with people or how you're engaging with people, finding experiential ways or finding different ways to communicate information and to try to engage with them is, I think, really important, especially with people with cognitive deficits. Because the sort of didactic exchanges that we all just kind of take for granted that we do, it doesn't always come easy for someone that has a brain injury. So when I want to talk about the cognitive processes, which means when I want to talk about these things that I have up here, I have kind of a game to play that expresses all of this. I can't really get into it right here just because of time reasons and space reasons, but this slide is set up in a particular way on purpose, right? So the hardware that we all possess functions in a particular way, and you can think about the cognitive processes as sort of links in a chain, or in this particular slide, everything is sort of working upstream to downstream, right? So what this means is upstream, we see that one of the cognitive processes, alertness, comes before attention, which is to say, if alertness is optimal, that means attention will be more optimal. And if alertness and attention is more optimal, that means processing will be more optimal, which then contributes to better memory encoding. You kind of see where I'm going with this? Yep. So executive functioning, those higher level functions that we possess, all of these things, that's sort of downstream, right? So when there's alertness, attention is improved. When attention is improved, processing is improved, memory encoding, and executive functioning. Now, I pay attention to this stuff because, again, when one is linked with another, I want to just pay attention because we're going to talk a little bit about the sort of who, what, why, and where, meaning like how can we deliver the services that we want to deliver to people while being aware or being mindful of their cognitive deficits, yeah? So we'll get into that a little bit as well. All right, so this is quite literally the WHO from 1972. That's Pete Townsend. He is still up in the air. He's not come down yet, from what I've heard. I don't know. So some factors to consider, right? So the WHO, and what I mean by this, I'm talking about ourselves, right? So when we want to deliver a service, whatever service that you're delivering, if you talk with someone and you feel like your client that you're working with has had a history of a brain injury or a cognitive deficit, right? Simple questions. Did you ever have an IEP in school? You did? Well, what was that about? Well, I have a learning deficit. Okay, cool. You find out from your client that they had a car accident and that they had lost consciousness for, 3-4 hours, or they were in a coma. So automatically you know that, there's probably some deficit in place here. So you want to strategize a little bit about how you're going to deliver the service that you want to deliver. Yeah? So the WHO. And so what I'm talking about is I'm talking about us, right? So how are you doing in that particular moment? Will you be able to self-regulate? One of the things that I think just a little bit of study into the world of brain injuries has provided me as a practitioner is that I recognize and understand folks that I'm sitting across from don't always have the same ability to engage the way I want to engage with them. And I think it can lead to frustration and it's difficult working with folks, but they think the reason why we have a frontal lobe to begin with is to connect with one another. And when I'm sitting across from someone else that's maybe not able to connect in the same way, it can be a challenge. But I think one of the things that I've learned is that, when I interact with people, can I make some compensate? Can I compensate for some things? And so it begins with just paying attention to yourself. Is now the right time? So I did a brain injury group yesterday where we talked about the basic message, the part of the group I was doing. When stress goes up, cognition goes down. This is another reason why Vinland Center exists in the first place. At the time that the program started, substance use disorder treatment in the state of Minnesota was very confrontational, and there was sort of thought that it was sort of rooted in personality constructs that had to be broken down, which meant there was a lot of confrontation. Well, confrontation spikes anxiety. Someone with a brain injury, anxiety goes up, their cognition goes down. So the very part of the brain that you want to teach them skills to practice relapse prevention skills is not working optimally because they're stressed out. So that was the message yesterday. So stress goes up, cognition goes down. Yesterday it was 6:30. I had been, working for 9-10 hours, and I was trying to get through a couple things before I left last night, and one guy in the program had a question they wanted to ask me in the hall, which are always my favorite questions, the ones in the hall, because I'm scooting from one place to another. And I felt like his question, my answer was probably going to be a no. It had something to do with a 5-piece band, maybe in his room on weekends, something like that. I didn't think I was going to say yes to this probably, but he caught me in the hall and he started talking to me, and I kind of just was trying to, listen the best I could. And I said, remember the group we had today about when stress goes up? He's like, probably not a good time to ask this question, is it? I'm like, probably not. He's like, how about tomorrow? I'm like, perfect. So that's just an example of can you couch it until tomorrow? I know this sounds like common sense, but yeah, if you can do it, because timing is really important. Being mindful of your tone and nonverbals. I will say this, people that I work with that might have cognitive deficits, they have a pretty strong emotional memory. Their didactic sort of memory or their sort of concrete working memory might not be the greatest, but they remember, who they had a pleasant interaction with and who they didn't. So just kind of staying mindful of those things. So some other factors to consider, the what. This is a painting, by the way. This was a painting done by a woman who is suffering from Parkinson's, she decided when she was diagnosed with Parkinson's that she was going to quit her job and become an artist. And all of her art has been kind of chronicling the sort of neurodegenerative part of the Parkinson's, which I find very fascinating. And some of her other pieces are kind of in these slides too, because it's a very interesting story. Okay, so factors to consider. So we consider ourselves, how are we doing? When we have an interaction with people, no matter what it is that you're doing, and then the what. What are you going to talk about? So is it wise to talk about something difficult at 4:15 on a Thursday afternoon? Probably not. So whenever you sort of kind of interact with people, maybe just finding out things. Hey, how are you doing? Is your week been busy? If we're meeting at 4 o'clock, is this a good time to talk about, X, Y, and Z? Maybe not. And then how long can they process time? So let's say you do have a meeting. Now is the time to talk about this. Great. Well, how long are you going to talk to them about? It seems like to me, if I'm working with someone with a moderate brain injury, and I would say that people mostly in the program have mild to moderate brain injuries at Vinland Center, and wherever you're meeting with people, I would imagine mild to moderate. When we get into severe brain injuries, there's really a lot of behavioral agitation that's very noticeable. And certainly we have people that show up in Vinland Center under those conditions as well that we work with, but mild to moderate, 20 minutes. If you got them, let's say you have to, if you're working in the system someplace where you're filling out lots of forms, you're a financial worker, you're a social worker, wherever it is that you're at, if you can kind of get 20 minutes of good content, and even if you just take a 5-minute break, just within the session, if you want to get on a sidebar and just be like, how about them Vikes against them Bills, man? How about that? That was a big deal, right? Just even that little kind of short break can be important. Yeah? And again, we try to, we don't have heavy therapy groups at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Thursday. That's where kind of experiential activities and other types of group happen later in the day. We have our sort of process therapy groups more in the mornings, 9 to 12, whenever that fits in. So just kind of being mindful of those things is super duper helpful. And then the why. Why are you getting together? What is it that you're going to be doing? So here's just a couple of things here. Lots of clicks. So understanding and then identifying up front, what's the purpose of, why are we meeting, what it is that we're going to accomplish. Sometimes I have to do what are called treatment plan reviews with clients. We do them once a week. I have somebody come in, I just tell them, I'm just going to be asking you some questions about how the week's been going, and it might get a little boring if there's some period where I want to give you some feedback. Maybe we'll do a little bit of that, but just kind of laying out the why and what it is that you're talking about. Because if I tell someone at 9 o'clock in the morning, hey, let's get together and update your treatment plan review, let's go over a couple things and da-da-da-da-da, we'll do that at 3 o'clock. If they show up at 3 o'clock, there's a 40% chance they're going to remember exactly what it is that we came for. So don't take for granted that they're going to remember kind of what the purpose is, and it's okay to just, start it off, just be like, here's what we're going to do. One of the most helpful forms of delivering feedback that I've ever run across, is a motivational interviewing guy, done some trainings, worked with some people throughout the years on some of that. Asking permission to give feedback is super, super helpful. It's just asking permission, It's very helpful. Deliver it at a pace that they can. One of the things that I have to remind myself, or others will remind me, is to slow it down a little bit. Tom, you're moving a little bit too fast there. So being mindful of your pace, also important. Which, where are we with pace? 3:15, I believe it is. Right? 3:15. It's almost coffee time. For me, it's 4 o'clock. Coffee time for you? When is that? Don't know? The coffee in the back is really great, by the way. Whoever made the coffee, thumbs up. I just had a little sip. Okay, the where. Where are you going to do this? These are the factors we're considering again, right? So what is the content from the last slide are you going to deliver, and where are you going to do it? So we have some folks that have been in the program that struggle under certain conditions, but you can frame a discussion around where we're going to do this in terms of conditions, right? So when this condition is present and when that condition is present, this might happen. Meaning we have an area of the building by a nurse's station, and sometimes our folks want to kind of talk about how upset they are they don't have their medications at a particular time in a certain place in a certain area and how they do that. It's not best to have that conversation in front of the nurse's office, because there's also the smoking door thing, there's the phone thing, there's this over here. That's probably the worst place to have that type of conversation. Vinland Center, the residential program where I work, has 178 acres, so I can get outside, of course. Was able to get outside until the snow hit. But just kind of understanding where you're going to be delivering content is super important, right? Okay. So these are some things that I'll typically factor in if I know kind of what people are doing and who they're working with and how they're working with. All of these are just examples of experiential ways to sort of teach brain functioning. Again, I think one of the things that you can do no matter what work it is that you're doing with people, and of course we're focusing a lot on gambling disorders here at this conference, so wherever you're meeting with those folks, if you're going to talk about these things, can you just begin to funnel ideas through the lens of just the hardware that people have, okay? And just kind of have experiential ways of expressing some of those ideas. Now, for example, I'll just give you one, the impulsivity timer. Okay, the impulsivity timers, which I used yesterday, again in my group. The greatest leap forward, people with brain injuries and cognitive deficits, and quite frankly, for people with substance use disorders or any compulsive use disorder in general, one of the greatest leap forwards that people can take is the ability and willingness to accept external cues to guide their behavior. So cues outside of them. So oftentimes, of course, we're very interested in being the sort of master of our own domain. We want to make our own decisions. There's a lot of power struggles that are embedded in the idea of independence. Independence, of course, it's really hard to sort of talk about the nuanced, paradoxical idea of when you are able to receive support that's actually very good for your independence, if we know what that means. It's a very difficult conversation to have, because quite frankly, it's quite abstract. To make it a little bit more concrete, I've done this before, and I just did it yesterday. You have a group, you're meeting with people, one person gets up, starts walking out of the group, you're like, hey, time out. Where are you headed? They're like, I'm going to the bathroom. And then I say, how long do you think it'll take to go to the bathroom? Which then they're always like, whoa, potty police, ease up. But I'm like, but what do you think? And then the group's like, oh man, he's gonna be gone for 20 minutes, man. He's gonna go, all this kind of stuff. So it gets into a little banter. I just say, well, how long do you think it'll be? He's like 3-4 minutes. I'm like, boom. I put it on my phone. I set the timer, 3 minutes. Boom, go. There they go. They leave, they come back. 9 times out of 10, they're interested. They come back. How long? 2 minutes, 45 seconds. Nice job. Everybody gets a big clap. It gets a big kick out of it. It's a lot of fun. But the point is made. The point is made. The person, all they did was give themselves to an external cue, which is my timer on my phone and the group support. And they came back. And they'll comment, like, I thought about it while I was going from point A to point B. I wanted to go out to the smoke shack. Probably the most profound experience I had with a client was a guy that was a construction worker. He fell off a scaffolding and hit his head, and his memory was, and his impulsivity was affected greatly. And he was quite anxious about it, especially around just every time, like, every time something happened, he would just, be impulsive, right? So he got up in group, was walking out, where are you going? He's like, I forgot to take my meds. So there's the memory impairment coupled with, now he's gonna go try to get his meds, but still come back to group. So I did the whole thing that I just shared with you, and so he's like, oh, so he goes, he comes back, and he was like, thumbs up, that was helpful. He said, I could feel the pull. I saw the smoke shack, I was gonna go have a heater. But then I'm like, wait a minute, no, I got 2 minutes. And then I'm like, gonna talk this, and somebody's like, hey, and he's like, but he came back and realized that, yeah, I do have a memory impairment and I am impulsive, and there was something outside of my mind that could help shape my behavior. And so he was quite energetic about his response to that. And again, the impulsive mind can't solve the impulsive mind problem, right? But it can respond to external or environmental cues, which is the basis of a lot of behavioral sciences and things like that. But if we can do that with people, it's helpful. And even if, let's say, you're meeting with someone individually, I've done this before too. It's like, let's do 20 minutes, just get through this boring assessment that we got to do, but we're going to do this. I'm going to set my timer right here on my phone, right? Boom, got it, good. Look at it, so timer's off, let's do this. It just kind of helps. It kind of shapes the environment that they're in. So that's one example. You're probably most confused by the hand model, so I'm not going to tell you anything about that, just so you can go like, hand model, what is he talking about? Weird guy. All right, simple guidelines as we're, what's 3:20, right? So we got about 10 minutes left. So a couple more slides. So some factors to consider, the who, what, why, where. Now just some basic guidelines. So if you're working with folks, many people, the 2 longest lasting symptoms post-brain injury are headaches and fatigue. And so lots of people just have low RPMs, low energy. So how can we work with them when they're going through periods of fatigue? Again, those, like what I talked about, the idea of taking a break, very helpful. Breathing exercises, light stretching, keeping instructions simple, of course, clear statements. I'm pretty fortunate. I have a pretty big group room, or just have worked primarily in a big group room. People can move around a little bit. There's like a sliding glass door. We can get some fresh air in there. Just things like that. Just kind of working through periods of fatigue. I was using peppermint oil too for a while, and I've run out. I have to I started getting like peppermint oil from some place in Utah. People were telling me it was like a Ponzi scheme or something. I have no idea, but maybe you know what I'm talking about. But peppermint oil is very helpful as well. Just put a little bit of peppermint oil like behind the ears. It kind of creates a little vitality. Make sure to tell them to put it behind their ears and not on their face, because that happened, and that's a whole thing in and of itself. Yep. Be mindful of your rate of, guess that word? Guess that word? Anyone? Speech? Who said speech? Nice. Speech, you get a free cup of coffee right in the back there. Nice job. Be mindful of your rate of speech. Yep. So again, that's something that I have to do, just kind of slow it down a little bit and make sure that people are following. Because this deals with slower processing. So folks that have slow processing, it doesn't mean that they can't understand things. It doesn't mean that they can't comprehend something. They'll just need more time to comprehend something. And that's typically the issue, is the processing speed, not the processing in general. And in fact, life happens pretty fast for some people, and then, trying to slow it down is really helpful. recognizing the potential for misinterpreting information. So one thing that I'll do, if I understand that their verbal memory is okay, meaning I can tell them something and they can hold on to it, because sometimes that's not the case. If I say like, X, Y, and Z at, LMNOP, if I don't think they can do it verbally, definitely have to write it down. But if they can do it verbally, one thing that I'll just do is, hey, repeat back to me what it is that we're doing now. Remind me. I'll do that a lot too, like just to, again, to kind of like keep the relationship strong and depersonalize things in a way. It's like, hey, knowing full well, I know what time we're going to call your probation officer at 10 o'clock, but it's like, hey, remind me, what time do we have to call your probation officer again? 10 o'clock. Okay, good. You know what I mean? Repeating things back so you can make sure that they understand it. Orientation and memory issues. So be prepared to restate information, as I mentioned in the last slide, and then work on building routines. So, folks with memory impairments that you run into, when you find out, if they tell you, I've got a memory impairment, or they have a memory impairment, the first thing everybody says when I have a memory impairment is what? Write things down, right? They hear that all the time, people tell them that all the time, and yeah, write things down. It's very important. But there's also a second component to it that most people don't talk about, and that's you have to build a routine around writing things down. So there were some studies done on memory in the late 60s, and basically what they found was that memory is more connected to behavioral routine management and routine building than they thought before. So in some ways, supporting memory is a very behavioral thing. So placing things in the most visual space is often something I talk about with people. Meaning, if you write things down, great, but then where will you put it in order to retrieve it? The retrieval part is the point of writing it down. I have a very visual space in my world where I park all my information that I need. It's a very visual space for me, and that's my email inbox. If you ask me something in the hall, if you need something, if it goes in my inbox, I can at least process it. And so that's where I have to land things. That's where I have to put things. Anything I want to remember, I have to put it there. So the point is, I don't have to try to remember anything. I'm just going to put it in a place where I stumble across it. It's the same phenomenon. If you want to remember to bring your gym bag to work and you can't forget your gym bag, the best place to put it is right up against your back door. You can put it in a bag and, got my gym bag right there. It's sitting on my living room couch. You might forget it, as you can imagine, right? So just kind of build, and just, again, talking to people about, like, it's great to write things down, and then let's build a routine around where you're going to put it and how you're going to retrieve it. That's it. Whoa, that was an abrupt ending. Sorry about that. Thank you. That was it. I usually have a little bit more something to kind of drift us into the last couple things, but I guess we're done with that. Thank you for your time and your effort and your energy. It was nice hanging out with you.